Good evening. Sometimes I wonder why I give talks about estimating. A lot of times I feel like this. You tell somebody something and say, I have some proof with papers and stuff, and it really doesn't change. But I'm going to try to approach the problem of estimation from a different direction and might give you some ideas about, if you estimate, how to improve your process. So why am I doing this? Well, many decades ago, I used to work with Kent Beck on some of the world's first agile extreme programming projects. And one of the things we were looking for were a better way to estimate, because we knew that people liked to estimate in time, but they're not good at it. So Kent said, why don't you come up with an alternative? So I thought, okay, why not? Why not come up with an abstract scalar unit, which we called the gummy bear, because there was a gummy bear store right next to the bank where we were working. We found out that this didn't work very well. I'm not going to go into too much detail because of time. So we gave up the idea, but it was picked up later by someone else and renamed into the story point. And still, that doesn't solve the problems we have. First statement. Estimating in time is not the problem. The political consequences of estimating in time is the problem. And by using some kind of unit that's abstract, you are just avoiding the problem and you're not confronting it. So what about me? I'm a psychologist. What's this psychology and psychometrics stuff? So in my approach, what am I trying to do? There are two things that I look at, especially in terms of estimating. One is, how do we deal with the problem that our data is crap? We have bad data. What can we do with the data we have to improve the quality of it and to work with the quality that we have? And second, what do we do? How can we deal with a climate that's toxic, where there's no psychological safety, a climate where an estimate is forced into a commitment, and estimates are bargained with and juggled with by people who have no risk when they're trying to push estimates in the wrong direction? These are some of the facts that I try to deal with. So what is psychometrics? Psychometrics is what separates us real psychologists from the amateurs. Psychometrics is the study of what we call a latent construct. A latent construct is something we can't directly measure. If we were together, I could measure your weight, I could measure your height. I could not directly measure your intelligence. I could not directly measure your level of depression, for example. These are things that we can only indirectly measure. Okay? The interesting thing about this is that any measurement that we have is of necessity an estimate. Since we can't directly measure it, we have to guess at it. And what we do with psychometrics, with statistics, is we use the statistics to make our guesses as good as possible. So this goes in two directions. Once, any measurement of a latent construct is an estimate, but that what we in software engineering say is an estimate, which is the amount of time we need to finish something, is a latent construct. It goes back and forth in both directions. So what psychometrics can help us with, it teaches us how to ask better questions. This is one of the things that we learn in psychology, is how to ask better questions. And it teaches us how to do better statistics on the answers that we get. So essentially, psychometric is the way that we psychologists flex our muscles, and we say, I can ask better questions than you, and I'll prove it because I have better statistical methods than you do. So what's the problem with estimation? Why are estimates normally so bad? There are a lot of reasons for that. One reason is that maybe people have a strategic interest in not estimating properly. Maybe there's reasons, it might be political or financial. Good example here. Berlin Airport. Supposed to open 2011. Do you think that there might have been some interesting reasons behind the estimates that brought them to the completion date of 2011? Just think about it. So, one of the classic reasons for estimates going wrong is something known as the planning fallacy. Planning fallacy was developed by these two gentlemen, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and was one of the things that won them the Nobel Prize in economics. The principle behind the planning fallacy is that estimates are wrong. People tend to over-optimistically estimate because they tend to go too strongly into detail about something and tend to ignore similar cases and the data that they can get from that. Okay? So, my thoughts that I'd like to share with you is, okay, if this is one fallacy, there might be a number of other fallacies. Okay? And this is still work in progress that I want to share with you, but I'd like to run this past you and see if it can convince you. One is something that I call the completeness fallacy. The idea of the completeness fallacy comes from this book, Complications from Atul Gawande, which is a very interesting book on how surgeons learn their craft. I remember reading this book, and the one thing that struck me were these questions. Do we ever tell patients that because we're still new at something, that their risks will be higher and that they'd likely do better with someone else who has more experience? When we give them the statistics about the success rates, do we ever tell them that these statistics are based on experienced people doing this? Do we ever say as a surgeon that we need for them to agree to it anyway because we need to practice these operations to get our certification? Right? Given the stakes, who in their right mind would agree to be practiced on? Right? The question is, if a surgeon comes to you, a young intern, and says, you need this operation, and you ask what the success rate it is, and he says, well, it's about 75%. Ask that question, 75%, based on which doctors are doing this and under which conditions. This is the completeness estimate. And this is where we get into psychometrics. Because the equation for estimation, it's a basic psychometric equation, is that the estimated value of anything is a combination of the true value of it, that we can't directly measure, and a systemic error, which is bias, which is influenced by the person doing the estimate, plus a random error. These three components put together the estimate. Okay? But then again, the true value of an estimate is a function of three variables. The true value of any work to be done is a function of the work that needs to be done, the person doing it, and the infrastructure, the instruments and tools available to that person. Okay? Additionally, we have something that we call a load factor. Now, a load factor, for those, I know there are a couple of real psychologists out there doing a structural equation modeling of load factor is a very good PhD project. I won't go into detail about that, but let me give you an idea what a load factor could possibly be. A load factor is any impediment that causes a task to take longer than is actually needed. Meetings that take away your time, issues with facilities, or issues with technology, the lack of tools, interference, team problems, personnel changes, unclarity about what the actual requirements are. All these things contribute to making things take longer. The problem is they're not predictable. And the other problem is they're what we call in psychology a confounding variable. They are things that will influence all the variables that we have. They'll influence the work that needs to be done, they'll influence the people doing it, and they'll influence the infrastructure and tools. And this is what makes this very challenging. Okay? So, another possible fallacy, the distribution fallacy. Okay? Another statement, think about this. An estimate is a range and not a number. since it's not exact, it is a range. Some of you who've been around IT for long enough might recognize this, the cone of uncertainty, saying that in the beginning, as it's not clear what to do, your estimates will have a large range. The clearer things get, the more accurate it is. We could take another look at this. Statistically, you would think that if you estimate a number of tasks, and let's say each task would be estimated to what? To 5 days, to a week. That statistically, you'd expect a distribution like this. Some things will be shorter, some things will take longer. You expect the Gaussian normal distribution. Logical, but wrong. If you look at, for example, these two studies mentioned down here, which total up something like 26,000 comparisons of estimates and actuals, what we see is that it's a left-skewed log normal distribution. Take a look at this. Rarely do things take shorter. Quite often, they take longer. Right? Think about this. Where this also creates a problem is for those of you who do Monte Carlo simulations. Monte Carlo simulations, based on random numbers taken from a distribution, take their numbers from a normal distribution and not from a log normal distribution. Which means that the basis for Monte Carlo simulations in the predictive capacity for software development estimations is questionable. So another thing, the logical consequence of this is if you look at sprint capacity, that's the inverse log normal distribution, you're going to hit a wall where there's no much more you can physically, mentally, possibly do in the time available. But because of that load factor and everything, there are many reasons that you'll be doing a lot less. Okay. Another fallacy, the groundhog fallacy. Groundhog fallacy thought came to me from the movie Groundhog Day. Every day the same thing happens. One day is like the other. If you're calculating velocity, okay, velocity is normally calculated as the average, the arithmetic mean of the last n sprints, where n is a number between 1 and 5. Okay? So, sounds logical. We'll just average up the last couple of sprints and see what the average number is here. This has an implicit assumption that's also questionable. The problem here is whether these data points are equally important, whether they're equally weighted. If you're looking at the last 5 or 6 two-week sprints, you're questioning, you're essentially saying that this data point from 2.5, 3 months ago is equally valid in its predictive capacity than the data from the last sprint. And if it is, what does that tell you about your team not learning? Your team not changing. Okay. There's a solution for that. That's doing an exponentially weighted moving average, where you can weight how important the last sprint is. Works very well in prediction. Since this actually is a tech talk, I do put in the obligatory code slide for this. If you want to work with this method, the best technique for an exponential smoothing is the Holt-Winters algorithm, but just do the first level algorithm, just calculating alpha, leave beta and gamma, which are seasonal and periodic trends, out, and you'll get a very nice number that will very clearly, it's very clearly stated that the predictive capacity of this algorithm is 1 for going forward, no more than that. Okay. Another fallacy, the objectivity fallacy. We're all right. We're all objective in the way we estimate. But are we? Do you recognize any of these statements? I don't understand that. Oh, I know what I'm doing. Oh, the new system will make it better. We started with 2 story points, so we can be 3 at maximum. Oh, he does Java. He'll be able to do that. Oh, don't worry about that. That's not important. Oh, that's exactly what I'm thinking. Of course, I think you guys are right. And based on the spec, these are all cognitive biases. So, the problem is, we've located at least 24 different cognitive biases that you need to be aware of. But our mind can deal with, at the most, 7 plus minus 2 at one time. Okay? So, what can we do for that? We put together a checklist of cognitive biases. You can download this checklist. I'll give you the URL afterwards. Use this when you're estimating with your team to go through and answer these questions. Is there some blind spot that you've overseen? Something that you might want to think about? Okay. So, estimation techniques. I notice I'm going a bit fast here. This talk is essentially the reduced version of a half-day tutorial and workshop, and I think I might have left a little bit out, but we'll see what we can do here. Estimation techniques. So what are some of the techniques that I use to help my teams get better at estimating? The comfort level. I prefer to estimate in time, but not only. Okay. If someone gives an estimate on something, I will ask them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable do you feel with that estimate? A 10 would be, I'll bet my job that I will need exactly that long to do it. A 1 would be, well, Joseph asked me for this estimate in front of everybody else, and I said something, but I don't believe it myself. And what this is telling you, this level of comfort, statistically, it's the inverse of a confidence interval. And what it's telling you, essentially, if you have a statistically significant set of estimates, this is your standard deviation. If it's a 10, your curve is going to be very small, going to be very accurate about that. If it's flatlining, it's going to be very difficult to say, yes, we're going to build something on this estimate. Then another technique I use, then, if somebody estimates something and says, well, 6 or a 7, I teach the product owner to ask the question, 6 or 7, how can I help you make that number into an 8 or a 9? This is an invitation for a conversation. Nice thing about this is this is the only way you can communicate this uncertainty and make it explicit. Even though your product owners and your managers might be unfriendly people, they can still come to you and say, well, why can't you be more sure than that? That's still an open question that might allow the opportunity to engage in conversation about this. What can I do to help you become more confident, more sure about this? The question is, the answer is quite often not, I need more time. The answer is often, I need more information about this. So what are we doing here? Essentially, mathematicians here, please excuse me, I think that since estimation is a complex activity, let's imagine estimates are complex numbers. Complex number has a real part and an imaginary part. The real part is the number itself. The imaginary part is fear. Fear is imaginary, it's irrational, it's below the surface, and if we don't watch out for it, it'll influence all the thoughts and all the decisions that we make. First step I do this refactoring. I said, let's deal with the number and let's deal with the fear factor separately. Let's take fear and then let's go Let's rationalize it. Let's bring it up to the surface. When you bring fear up to the surface, what it becomes is risk. Risk is rationalized fear. There's a risk that when you estimate something, when you take a guess, that number is going to be wrong. Yep, shit happens. That's the game that we're playing. But if you, for example, when you were younger, when you were a little child, and you told your mother, look, Mom, I'm going down the street to my friends to play. And your mother said, be home at 5 o'clock for dinner. And you said, sure, I know. I'll be home at 5 o'clock. But you were having so much fun that you didn't watch the clock, and it became 5 o'clock and 5:30 and 6 o'clock. And at 6:30, your father came down and grabbed you and dragged you home. These bad memories, oops, if I get things wrong, I might be punished, will influence the way you think at a subliminal level. So next thing we do, once we're aware that there's a risk inherent in any estimation process, is take the next step and let's quantify this. You can quantify it any way you want. I prefer using a Likert scale, 1 to 10. You can do 1 to 7 or something like that. By doing this quantification, what you're getting is value neutral information that you can then deal with without any emotion involved in it. And then you can go back and say, okay, my level of comfort for this estimate is a 6 or a 7. And the product owner can say, okay, how can I help you get that better? If you're doing estimation for fixed price projects, you're never going to have enough time to do research. Using this idea of a comfort level, something that a lot of people do implicitly already, will help you say, well, which parts of this are high risk? High risk are things where our comfort level is low. If we have anything that has a comfort level of 7 or above, that's okay right now, just to put together a bid. Anything that's between maybe 4 and 7, let's spend the resources and the time we have to look more in detail at that. Anything that might be below a 4, we're really going to have to consider if we want to put that in the contract or not. Use that like that. So, some other techniques. Chronobiology. Chronobiology is the science of our bodily rhythms. This, my sleeping pattern from a while back. I've been having some problems with sleep apnea. I ended up in the hospital in the sleep lab, and they did research, and they found out that my patterns look sort of like this. Back in the 1950s, Nathaniel Kleitman and his colleagues found out that when we sleep, we have a rhythm, a cycle of around 90 minutes, which is known as the BRAC, the Basic Rest Activity Cycle. That's the rhythm where we have light sleep, deep sleep, rapid eye movement when we dream. It's a basic rhythm in 90 minutes. When we're sleeping, this is a sine wave because nothing externally is influencing our thought processes. When we're awake, though, this rhythm continues. But since we're working, it becomes a rhythm of cognitive decline. This rhythm is circadian, which means it's synchronized to light and dark, which means all our rhythms tend to be roughly the same. And we see this, a lot of us, in the way we work, depending on which country you're in, I'd say. A lot of us will start working around 9 o'clock, we'll go to about 10:30 or so, then take a coffee break. 90 minutes plus minus. So Kleitman says somewhere between 80 and 110 minutes. Okay? Then you take a 15-minute break or so, work again, 10:45 to maybe 12:15, and then you take a lunch break. Then you come back after lunch, and nothing seems to work after lunch. Ever notice that? The problem is that our lunch breaks need to be 90 minutes because although we're in cycle in the morning, when we come back after lunch, if we don't have a 90-minute lunch break, we're coming back out of cycle. So This is the way that I like to structure a work day. It's difficult in countries like Spain, where the rhythm is different, but in most European countries I've worked with, structuring the day into 4 units. 1 unit in the morning until the coffee break, then coffee break until lunch, lunch until coffee break in the afternoon, there to the end of the day. This technique for estimation, we call it the quattro stagioni method. And the quattro stagioni is a pizza, and this is just a reminder of Thomas that he has to order pizza for afterwards. So I said, look, if this is the way that we're going to structure the day, why don't we estimate in these units? By the way, next slide, the name quattro stagioni, this idea came from my dear friend Paolo back when we were working for a well-known racing team that we couldn't mention here. But the idea is, if this is the way that we tend to structure things instinctively, this is an inner clock that we feel. We don't know how long an hour is if we don't look at a clock. We know how long until we need a break, how long until we lose concentration. Those people who smoke know exactly how long until they need a cigarette. The fun thing about estimating using the quattro stagioni method is, let's say you do task breakdown and your tasks are at the most 1 day in length. Essentially, your estimation process is, if you come in the start of the day, don't have anything else to do, do you think, oh, if you start working on it, do you think you'll be done by the coffee break? Or do you think you need until lunch? Think you need until coffee break in the afternoon? Or do you need all day? That's estimation using our internal rhythms and using our instincts. And what happens, if you need a little bit longer, okay, take your break and maybe a little bit later. If you're done before that, interesting thing that happens is that teams tend to synchronize on this if everybody's using the same rhythm. And during my work at a number of my clients, what the teams notice is that, okay, everybody's synchronized into this rhythm. We'll do breaks together. The teams suddenly ended up having not 1 daily scrum, but 4. They had 4 simple, impromptu, informal meetings. And the advantage was that no small problem had the time to become a big problem without somebody picking it up. Okay? Think about it. It's a very simple method to do this. Something else, another method that I really think is valuable is something called reference class forecasting. This is a method that's been researched up in Oslo based on Kahneman and Tversky's planning fallacy, saying that essentially we have to look for similar cases, and we can group those cases into reference classes. This is one of Flyberg's classic papers on this concept of reference classes. If you're doing something the way that a lot of agile people say you should do, you should have a reference story and compare everything to that. Let's avoid even getting into the problem that relative estimating is not estimating, it's comparison. If you have one reference story, what you have is a single data point that has no statistical properties. A reference class is a group of similar stories that will have statistical properties like standard deviation, like a mean, like a median, like skewness, like kurtosis, everything in there. Okay? If I don't fly much nowadays, but if I got into a plane and flew from Zurich to London, flight attendant would say, our flight time from Zurich to London is going to be 1.5 hours. How do they know that? Do they calculate airspeed? Do they run all that through supercomputers? No. They have a reference class. They collect the data on all similar flights under these conditions. And then, if you need one number, you can regress towards the mean, and then you have the standard deviation of that. So what they're essentially telling you is the mean time for this is going to be around so long. Okay? And as we all know, when flights are delayed, when you get in late, it's normally not because the flight took longer. It's because of the load factor, because of problems on the ground, either at the airport you're flying from or the airport that you're arriving to. So, reference class forecasting, relatively simple. You identify ways to group your previous experiences. Find a number of buckets to put them in. Yeah, you're not going to get it right in the beginning, but start working on it. Find buckets. They should be big enough so that you have a decent sample size that you can do the statistics on, but they shouldn't be narrow enough so that they're quite specific. Okay? And then you do the probability distribution for that. What you again find is the problem with a lot of these estimates, that your probability distribution is not going to be a Gaussian normal distribution. It's probably, if you're doing estimations on software tasks, it's going to be a log normal distribution. It's going to be skewed. Remember that. So you can compare the tasks that you're going to have to do with tasks that are in the different buckets. That's essentially the way you do it. So what happens if you don't have reference classes? You're going to need to do a bunch of work in order to generate that data. There is a simple way to do this. If I'm starting teams out and we're trying to collect the data, there's a relatively simple way of doing this. And it's a variant of t-shirt sizing. If I don't know anything else about this, I'm going to define different sizes of tasks, and I'm going to map them to time. Up on the website, you will find data. I have statistics for t-shirt sizes with 100 estimations for each size in a log normal distribution with all the statistical properties. Download that, play with that, and see how far you come. Okay? So, another thing to remember what I said about log normal distributions and about the mean, what I said about exponentially weighted moving averages. If you do not have a Gaussian normal distribution, this bell curve, the median is more robust against outliers. Remember that. Use the median value and not the mean. Some other thoughts on this. Estimates have a shelf life. They have a shelf life of maximum 1 sprint. Why? Estimates are based on the value of 2 volatile variables. The first variable is the state of the system, saying essentially, if we're here, how long will it take us to get there? But as you do work, you're changing that starting point, which may invalidate your estimate, which means it might be a good idea to take a look at that. Secondly, an estimate is based on the current state of your knowledge. And as you work, and as you do other things, the state of your knowledge is changing. You're learning. You're discovering new things. But doing that may also invalidate the base for your estimates. So it makes sense, especially for the things that are coming up soon in the future, to take a look at it again, to re-estimate them. Make sure that your estimates are still valid for them. Another technique, unpacking. Something we know is task breakdown. This comes from a paper from Kruger and Evans. For those of you who follow psychology, Justin Kruger is the second half of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And what they say is that when you start unpacking, when you start taking things apart and looking at the individual tasks, you tend to get a better estimate. You tend not to be too optimistic. The more complex something is, the higher this effect is. Okay. So some last techniques on here if you're working on estimating. These techniques come from a paper from 2011 from Danziger and colleagues who were doing research into the way judges reviewed court cases and looking at their chronobiology and looking at the rhythm in which they're working. They discovered that for court cases, for prisoners who are going to be out, possibly paroled, at the beginning of one of these cycles, they would grant 64%, essentially 2/3 of them would be granted parole. At the end of that clock cycle, it was 0%. So in order to make this fair, what they found out, there are a couple of things you need to do. First, take rests. Don't make any session longer than 90 minutes. Okay? Don't make sessions longer than 90 minutes, which is a question if you're doing 2-hour meetings. How effective are the meetings? Even now, in the time of COVID, in the time that we're doing things virtually, even 90 minutes is more difficult. Right? Take rests. Allow yourself to regenerate. Secondly, you have to go in with a positive attitude about this. And glucose. Glucose gives the energy to your brain, which gets us back to the gummy bears. I don't know if I'm going to be able to change anything with this talk. I hope I've got a couple of you interested in realizing that there are other ways of things to do to help improve your estimates. This is only part of the story. The other part of the story is dealing with the psychological safety and the toxic climates that you have in the organizations. That's a topic for another talk. I'm not going to be able to get the world rid of story points and get to better estimating. But let's try to build, instead of that, build a new model that removes the necessity of having to estimate in these other units. So I'm pretty much done now. I'd like to thank a number of people. I'd like to thank my dearest friend Yvonne, who helped me with all these things and keeps my mind straight on this. Also my friend Christine, who did all the drawings for me. Julie Hendry, who reviewed this material and gave me some ideas for naming the fallacies. And Dr. Boris Altemeyer, professor for psychometrics, who reviewed all this stuff and made sure that all the numbers were right. You can find more information here at this website. You'll find this is a page on my website with data for other versions, the slides for other versions of the talk. I will be uploading this version slides sometime tomorrow. You'll also find an Excel spreadsheet and workbook. If you want to try to do some of these techniques in Excel, you'll find code for a project in R, which is where we do all our statistical work on. And you'll find a number of references. Speaking of references, anybody who knows me knows that this has a solid foundation in science. So these are some of the references that I use for this talk. And here are some more of the references that I use from the talk. And here are some more of the references I use for this talk. And if you want to go on, here's some additional references about why this stuff works, and even more references, and even more references. And since I'm not done yet, there's a lot of work that's been done in psychology over the past decades about how to estimate in time and how to deal with statistics of it. Okay? So, I'm finished.
I ask you the questions that we have in the chat. And the first one is a comment. It's from Jose Lopez. I don't know if you remembered him. He says, "Great to see you again, Joseph, after a long time."
Hi, Jose. Thank you. Thank you. That's always encouraging.
And then we have a question from... he removed the question. I think the question was, what's your take on the no estimate movement?
Take on no estimates movement. I like and respect Vasco Duarte a lot. A lot of the ideas that came from that he had came from his and my time working together at Nokia and doing research on estimates. And what he discovered was that if teams were estimating in story points, as long as they were breaking down their stories in a repeated manner, he found out that the correlation coefficient between the number of story points and the number of stories was so high that he said, look, don't estimate, just break the stories down small and just count the number of stories, which is a very valid technique. It's also known as small sizing. You see a lot of people like Josh Karyevsky's people at Industrial Logic and others who also propagate this technique, break things down into smaller chunks. Once again, this is unpacking. That'll get you better estimates. Vasco went and expanded this to say, well, we don't need to estimate at all, which I think is very interesting philosophically, because it confronts us with the uncomfortable question of what value do estimates bring us? So his alternative was to say, well, let's stop estimating at all, which is valid, and he's very consequent in the way he does it. I just said that, okay, we know that people like to estimate in time, but they're not good at it. But hold it, I'm a psychologist. I can quantify not good. And then if I focus on that, I can take a look at how can make that not good better, how to make things more accurate. Right? Accurate is another question. Somebody brought up in one of the posts on LinkedIn, how do we define accurate? Accurate may be two things. One might be decreasing the delta, a difference between estimates and actuals. Another might be stabilizing the correlation coefficient. So if we can actually stabilize it and say our exchange rate is constant, we've won there already.
So there are some more questions besides lots of applause. And one is, how important is practice?
Can I go back to that slide about the surgeon? The success rate of this operation is 80%. It's open heart surgery. I've never done it before. This is the one thing they never say. It's 80% success rate when the head surgeon does it in a university hospital. But what happens if the intern's doing it out in a battlefield, right? Practice. If you don't have practice, if you don't have the data, your estimating is going to be bad. And there's no other solution besides practicing this. Another thing, and this is something that many teams are woefully lacking, is actually practicing and then comparing the estimates to the actuals. Back in the old times, back when I had hair, right, the beginning of extreme programming times, we actually had the role of the tracker. The tracker is a person who would go around and track everybody's estimates and compare them to their actuals and try to figure out why people's estimates were off and what they could do to get better at it. With data protection laws and everything nowadays, and with workers' councils, there's no way you could get away with that now. But still, you have to practice and you have to have that feedback in order to improve your craft, to understand which part of this load factor is it that's skewing you.
There is another comment and question from Philippe Defray. He says, or writes, great talk. Would learn would learning system thinking help in generating better estimates, realizing a small chunk is actually a lot of chunks? So we might overcome our system's bias?
I don't know enough about that to have an opinion on it. One thing that I know will help, once again, is unpacking, is task breakdown. And that Kruger and Evans study has been replicated. So it's a valid psychological study. And that's what I would tend to do because that's a technique that's a lot easier to do. And it's something that we know already as task breakdown.
We have a question from Remy that is talking later. Extreme programming is an interesting topic. What's your take on it?
I was one of the people who helped invent it, so my opinion is not objective. I think it's great. I think extreme programming is too difficult. If you want to hear more about that, there's a talk I have online called I Don't Know Anything. I can start expanding on that, but we're going to then really go over time. But extreme programming is very good, it's very valid, it's very difficult. There's a reason that Kent called it a discipline of programming. You need to have that discipline in order to do it. We used to joke that the reason we did pair programming is because nobody had the discipline to do it alone.
Good, I saw Remy smiling on the camera. So are there any other questions from the audience? See some applauses again.
Feel free to get in touch with me on LinkedIn. Happy to continue the conversation there. Okay.
Okay, so then if there are no more questions, I would suggest that we switch over now to Remy and give us a few seconds to do that.
Thank you.